Hi, I'm Robbie Bobby, grateful member of ACA. The topic of this video is 12 ways to look at the 14 traits, part 2. In the last video, which you can find on my YouTube channel, part 1, I covered the first 3 ways, which include identification. In other words, do I have this trait, and if so, to what degree? How do I interpret this trait? And what are the symptoms? What behaviors or feelings go along with them? In this video, I'll cover the next 3, which are what triggers them, at what age did I develop them, and how did they help me as a child? Okay, so let's start with number 4 on the list, which is what triggers them. You could also say what activates them, or in some cases, what dials them up to an unhealthy level. In the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill W. wrote that character defects are normal traits that are dialed out of their normal and useful range. I believe that some of the traits fall into this category. For example, trait 2 says, we became approval seekers and lost our identity in the process. The first part of the trait mentions approval seeking. Seeking approval is not in and of itself a bad thing. Luckily, this trait defines the point where it becomes a problem or a trait, and that is when I lose my identity in the process. Essentially, it's where my identity becomes the approval seeker. Okay, so what would cause or trigger normal approval seeking to dial up to the point where I may lose my identity? Well, another trait, trait 12, mentions that we'll do anything to hold on to a relationship. The same trait also says that we're terrified of abandonment. I think this has something to do with it, which means if I feel, or rather if my inner child feels, that I may be abandoned, and there are many, many forms of abandonment. It's a very big topic in ACA. Then it'll likely cause my approval seeking to dial up beyond its normal and useful range. For me, the trigger can be as simple as a girlfriend going from a happy mood to a more neutral or even pensive mood. My inner child will immediately believe that it's done something wrong and better cheer her up before she dumps me. This is just one tiny example. You can spend hours drilling into each of these traits, but I think being aware of just 1 or 2 triggers for each one will help you to understand them better, and therefore help with your recovery. Let's move on to number 5. Number 5 asks the question, when? When did this trait or traits begin to show up in my life? So if I'm looking at, let's say, trait 10, which says we have stuffed our feelings from our traumatic childhoods and have lost the ability to feel or express our feelings because it hurts so much, denial, this trait is easy because it points back to our childhood. It mentions it right in the trait. But can you think of specific examples of doing this at a particular age? And of course, not just for this trait, but for all of them. Some traits start with the words we became, such as we became isolated and we became approval seekers. When did I become these things? At 10 years old? At 5 years old? I remember at a very young age, my mother was angry and smashing dishes on the kitchen floor. Although I was very frightened, I got on my hands and knees and started picking up the broken pieces. I can distinctly remember this, and feeling somehow it would stop her from getting more upset, perhaps at the mess that she had made. I'm not sure if this is related to trait 6. We have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. In other words, that I was responsible for making her happy. Or 3, we are frightened by angry people. It's probably a combination of both traits. Answering the when question can be difficult for some of these traits due to the distance and time. For any that I can't think of specific examples, or if I'm not sure about my age, I just assume I had the trait by the age of 5. And this brings us to number 6 on the list, which is directly related to number 5. and that is, how did this trait or traits help me as a child? In ACA's literature, the 14 traits are often called survival traits. They're also referred to as defense mechanisms. Now, don't take ACA's word for it. Can you see how the traits helped you survive your childhood? Go down the list of traits and think about how each trait helped you and write it down, or at least make a mental note of it. Sometimes the traits help us to literally survive, and other times it's to survive emotionally, to avoid painful abandonment feelings or other debilitating feelings such as shame and grief. A great example is trait 10. We have stuffed our feelings from our traumatic childhoods. It's easy to see how stuffing feelings can protect us. When I acknowledge this, I can understand why I developed this trait in the first place and why I used it for so many years. Because it worked. Other traits are not so easy to make sense out of, such as trait 11. We judge ourselves harshly. How on earth was this trait trying to help me or defend me as a child? The answers are not simple. They reside in the unconscious part of the mind, which is where the inner child as well as the critical inner parent reside. Sometimes the harsh judging is done to point out faults that must be corrected in order to receive approval from the actual parent. This, of course, is in the mind of the critical inner parent. Sometimes it's to justify the abandonment the child has experienced, because psychologically it's terrifying to think your parents are defective. It's better to think you are defective. Therefore, the critical inner parent is actually trying to help. The problem is that my critical inner parent is still trying to help me. And understanding this is part of the recovery process. I used to think my dysfunctional behaviors were simply who I was. Now I realize it's how I was conditioned. And if I can be conditioned, then I can be reconditioned. So that's all the time we have for this video. In part 3, I will talk about the next 3 ways that I look at the 14 traits. All 3 have to do with the Tony A steps, where we'll look at the traits through the lens of powerlessness and unmanageability, which is step 1, as well as the healing effects of clarity, trust in a higher power, and unconditional love. I'm Robbie Bobby. Thank you for listening, and as always, keep coming back.